Okay, good afternoon. It's great to see old friends, new friends, colleagues, and of course our friends from RAND who are here for this very interesting topic and presentation. But this is the finale of the year, right, Suzanne? This is the final one? Inshallah. So this is also a great moment that we're celebrating with our colleagues and friends from RAND a very active and engaged year with a lot of events, particularly tackling the refugee issue. And the subject of today's talk is actually the results or reporting on the results of an extensive study happening in different countries in the region under the idea whether we can and ways to create opportunities for both refugees and their host communities. We know those who are engaged in the subject of refugee question, this protracted crisis that has been a very, very hard topic to deal with when it comes to opportunities for refugees. The narrative of the burden, the narrative of the refugees taking all the resources have been quite heavy on all of us, and we've been trying to counter it. So this comes really very nicely to tell us, based on evidence, how we could actually create mutual beneficial opportunities for both. So in the interest of time, I'll just present our distinguished speakers from our friends in RAND. We have Dr. Krishna Kumar, who's a senior economist and the director of international research at RAND Corporation, and Dr. Louay Constant, who's a senior policy researcher. It's a long bios, but you can read it in the report and in the book. And we have a couple of copies we'll keep them in the institute, but if you're interested, you can pass anytime and check them out. And there's a policy brief or policy paper out of them in English and Arabic, and that would be also another opportunity to share online or in print. So thank you very much for coming. I'll give now the floor to our friend Krishna, please. I'll give you 15 minutes, or maybe it's Louay. Who will start?
We
Krishna.
will weave in and out, but we will try to keep the presentation to 30 minutes or so that we can have an active discussion. But I first want to say thanks so much to you, your center, Suzanne, all of you for making this happen. As you know, we came and you were one of the first people we talked to when we came here in January. So when you talk about refugees in Lebanon, nearly everybody says first go talk to Nasser. So we came and talked to you, as you remember. So we've done a lot of work during the course of the year. So it's a pleasure to come here and present. And I really appreciate all of you, taking time off your busy schedules and coming here as well. Yeah. So as Nasser said, the title of this report that we published is Opportunities for All, Mutually Beneficial Opportunities for Syrians and Host Countries in the Middle Eastern Labor Markets, and in particular we focus on Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. This study was funded by the Qatar Fund for Development, to whom we are deeply grateful. We appointed an advisory council with several of the UN agencies who have been at the forefront of the refugee operation, a few Qatari philanthropists, as well as the Tent Foundation, which is based in New York. So just to give you an overview, we'll talk a little bit about setting the scene. Nobody here really needs to know too much about the current situation, which, as Nasser said, has preoccupied all of you and all of us for several years. Quickly go through the overview of the countries and maybe spend a little bit of time comparing Lebanon with the situation in Jordan and Turkey as well. And then recommendations. Our report is fairly bulky. That's why we didn't have enough copies for everybody. It's like 300 pages, but it's available on our website, rand.org, as well as our research brief and so on. So as you all know, 60% of the Syrian population has been displaced in the conflict, which is now in its 8th year, over 6.5 internally displaced, 6 million or so in the neighboring countries. Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan having most of these people. The actual numbers are, of course, constantly under dispute based on people who officially registered versus the actual realities on the ground. So even though we say Lebanon has 1 million refugees, some estimates would put them at 1.5 million. We are aware of that. Same thing in Jordan. It says 660,000, but the Jordanians would claim it is close to 1 million. The average length of displacement of refugees worldwide is 17 years. So clearly the need has gone beyond providing humanitarian assistance, immediate shelter, health, and so on, to providing opportunities for them for as long as they are in the host country's economic opportunities. A meeting we had a few years back with someone in Jordan started us on this path, where this person was saying, it was the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce, actually, in Amman. It's not clear to us why we are thinking of refugees purely as a problem, because they can help fill gaps in the labor market and actually contribute to the economy and add value. And that's what started us thinking in this line, and luckily we were able to get some funding from the Qatar Fund for Development. And so what we try to do is to examine the labor market situation from the supply and demand side in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. We get the perspectives of stakeholders as well as host country workers, refugees and expats, as well as firms. And at the end of the day, we try to provide a few policy recommendations, and we will talk about that as well. So clearly, we are not the first people to get into this field. The most recent 3RP report was released recently, and there is great work done by the UN, by Issam and others. So we are really standing here on the shoulders of giants. But we have a few unique things, I think, that our study adds. So first of all, it's cross-country. We do a fairly deep dive into Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. We do what's called a mixed method study. So we had over 60 stakeholder interviews, 12 in-depth interviews of employers, focus groups, 36 focus groups across these 3 countries, a household survey to understand the labor supply, 600 per country, and firm survey, 150 per country. This itself is fairly unique. Few studies have done sort of like a supply-demand analysis by surveying both firms and households, likewise talking in focus groups both to the refugees as well as the host country workers. Actually, we also talk to other expats. So, and then it allows us to do this cross-country comparison in a reasonably quantitative way. To give you a sample of the people we met in Lebanon, I already mentioned Dr. Nasser. We also met Tom and many of his colleagues in many of the UN agencies, as well as the US Embassy, the Ministry of State for Displaced Affairs. The aim is not to give a complete list, but just so that you get a feel for the different kinds of stakeholders with different incentives, different viewpoints. We try to capture as many of these as possible. Any survey-based study is only as good as the data that you can collect. We were fortunate to work here with Ipsos, which is a renowned international survey agency. In Turkey and Lebanon, we worked with them. In the case of Jordan, we worked with an organization called MRO, which is likewise very reputed. The focus groups, we tried to stratify across region, both men and women. So if you look at the case of Lebanon, we had focus groups in Beirut and Mount Lebanon, Bekaa Valley, where the most number of refugees within Lebanon reside, and Tripoli and South Lebanon as well. We had a set of focus groups for Egyptian migrants, who are the people who in some sense compete, if you will, with the Syrian refugees for jobs, Syrian men, Syrian women, as well as Lebanese men and women who are in the labor force. One thing I need to mention is that RAND has a very strong IRB internal review board. We have done some pioneering work on human subjects protection, and especially given the really sensitive topic here, we had to go through an extensive protocol vetting by them before we could start the project by way of privacy, data protection, so on and so forth. So I mentioned we did 600 surveys per country, and these again were broad-based, the areas I already mentioned in Lebanon. Our aim was not to get a fully representative survey from which you can draw population estimates and so on. We just didn't have the time or the money, and especially because we're doing it in 3 countries, but hope to get a broad enough coverage that whatever data we're going to show, Louay will show that in a minute, is broadly representative of these various groups. Likewise, for firms, we surveyed 100 small firms, 50 medium and large firms, and what we tried to do is we tried to survey firms near where the refugees are concentrated, because the hope is that they can get jobs close by, though especially in Turkey, the issue of everybody thronging to Istanbul and whether we can find incentives for them to get dispersed to the second-tier cities, is also important. So, we focused on some of the key sectors which either are employing refugees currently or are more likely to employ refugees in the future: food and beverage, construction. Most of our firms actually were in wholesale and retail trade, including motor vehicles repair, hotels and restaurant, and as well as cleaning, because environment is one of the sectors in which refugees can work, Syrians can work here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Louay, who will quickly walk through some of the data. Again, the amount of data is overwhelming even for us, even though we have lived and breathed it for a year. So our aim here is not to go into too many of the gory details, but just so that you get an idea of the kind of data we collected.
Great. Thank you, Krishna. I also want to reiterate Krishna's earlier comments and thank Dr. Nasser and the Issam Faris Institute for hosting us today. It's encouraging to see so many young faces in the audience, because I think the solution to this issue is going to rest on the shoulders of the current young generation in Lebanon and future generations. So, as Krishna mentioned, we conducted a survey of both Syrian refugee households and firms. I will focus much of my discussion on the findings of that survey. And essentially, I'll start by giving just a broad context in each of the 3 countries, and then share the results of our findings in Lebanon in a little bit more, with a little more focus. So it's helpful to look at, one of the I think the unique characteristics of this study is that we looked across 3 countries, and so there's an opportunity there to kind of learn from experiences across all 3 countries. The situation in Turkey is interesting in the sense that you have high concentrations of refugees in the border towns, in Urfa and Kilis, and some of the border areas between Turkey and Syria. And then you have a very high concentration in Istanbul because of refugees leaving the border cities to find employment opportunities there. It's also, Turkey has the largest number of refugees at about 3.5, 3.6 million, but it's important to point out that as a proportion of the population, Lebanon has the highest percentage as a proportion of the population. Interestingly enough, in Turkey, maybe because of the size of the Syrian refugee population, the number of new businesses, about 1 in 3 newly established foreign businesses were established by Syrian refugees. So that's an important statistic to keep in mind as far as sort of entrepreneurship among some of the Syrian refugees in Turkey. In Jordan, Jordan's the only country that's actually done a census that's included Syrian refugees, so they have probably more precise estimates of the number of refugees, and around 1 million, although formally registered more like 660,000. Jordan has dealt with, and I think it's similarly with Turkey and Lebanon, but Jordan in particularly was impacted by the security situation in the region, the closing of the border with Iraq, the closing of the border with Syria, and the loss of it as a trade partner, and that has really affected the economic situation there. One of the sort of key contextual findings with Jordan is that the jobs that Syrian refugees tend to take are jobs that migrant workers such as Egyptians, Iraqis, and others are doing in Jordan. So that's important to keep in mind. Jordan also, as a backdrop, Jordan also has the Jordan Compact, which is an agreement with the European Union to open up trade with the European Union, and the criteria for meeting that requirement is that they hire Syrians. But the problem has been in the implementation of this compact. Okay, so focusing much more on Lebanon, I think these are numbers that all of you are very, very familiar with. About 1.5 estimated. This is something that you learn when we spoke with stakeholders in Lebanon, and certainly confirmed in our survey, in our focus groups, that one of the big issues that refugees face is the lack of a residency permit, and the constraint that the lack of a residency permit places on their movement around the country and their access to employment opportunities. Lebanon, of course, has the crisis response plan, the capital investment plan. Those are all initiatives that are intended to potentially create jobs for Lebanese and for Syrians. But as you all know, there has been an issue with trying to get that implemented for various reasons. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the survey results. I will start with the household survey, and we applied a very simple framework, which is sort of a supply-demand framework. We're looking at the characteristics of supply, the characteristics of households, and the people we interviewed about their education, their skills, their employment perceptions and experiences. And then I will talk about the demand side, which are the firms, the companies that would be hiring Syrians. So I'm going to only highlight 1 or 2 points in each slide, but if you have a question or a comment, please stop me and ask at any time. Yes. The survey was only done of Syrian refugee households. The focus groups were done with Syrian refugees, Lebanese, and with migrant workers, but the survey was only Syrian households. So just a quick comment on the structure of the household, generally large households in terms of the number of people in the household. Turkey had the largest on average household size, so Syrian refugee households in Turkey seem to be larger than both Jordan and Lebanon, but still relatively large in Lebanon. We asked the household about its income sources, just to get a sense of where they're getting income. And I think one thing that is important to point out with Lebanon is that Syrian refugee households in Lebanon tend to, more than the other two countries, tend to draw their income from work. So somebody's working in the household in Syrian refugee households that is bringing in income, more so than in the other two countries. They could say income coming from salary, income coming from benefits, but certainly almost 100%, with the exception of one governorate, were drawing their income from salary work. We asked about their education levels. So we got information about the household, and then we randomly selected one person to ask more detailed questions about employment experiences. And generally speaking, the education level of our survey respondents was quite low. So half or more, at least up to half of them had a primary level education or less. So we're talking fairly low education level among our survey respondents. A very distinctive feature of Syrian refugees in Lebanon is the number of them who are participating in the labor force. So even though there are restrictions on getting a work permit and being able to work, they're actually working informally at fairly high numbers. So especially the men, almost 100% across all governorates are engaged in some kind of economic activity. Less so for women, but still relatively high, especially if you compare that to the percentage of women participating in the labor force in Syria prior to the war. So that number is about 13%. Across all three countries, it's on order of 20% or more. So, and it's pretty high in Lebanon. On the flip side of it, unemployment is high as well. So this is a measure of the percentage of people who are willing to work but aren't working. So they're not working, but they're willing to work. And it's low for men. Men are able to find jobs. It's very high for women. So women are facing barriers in terms of finding work, but they're willing to work. For those who are not working, we asked them why they weren't working. There were a range of reasons given. Most prominently among them was that they couldn't get a work permit. And I think this is also closely tied to the residency issue. We asked them how they found out about work, both those who are working and those who are not working but looking for work. And generally, informal networks are the most common way that people find work. Not surprisingly, they report fairly low wages, so they're not earning a lot of money per month. And it sort of ranges, of course, higher in Beirut, lower in Baqa'. I think most of the individuals working in Baqa' are probably in the agricultural sector where they're not going to earn very high wages. We also asked them about whether they were working more than they would like to work or less. So just to try to get a sense of whether they'd like to be working more hours during the day or more weeks during the month. And generally speaking, they're working more than they would like, and I think this is an aspect, it goes hand in hand with the issue of wages. If they're not earning very much, they have to work longer hours, and so those two go hand in hand. So we asked them to report it in per month. They just told us what the average number of wages they worked per month. We asked our survey respondents what sector they were working in currently and what sector they worked in before coming to Lebanon, so in Syria. And generally speaking, they are working in, generally speaking, the same types of sectors. And I think this is consistent with the story that many of the Syrians have historically gone back and forth between Lebanon and Syria to work in seasonal work. So many, for example, those working in agriculture who would cross the border, work in Lebanon during the agricultural season, and then go back. So generally speaking, they are working in some of the same sectors. More of them working in construction than they worked in, so more people finding opportunities in construction, wholesale and retail trade, but in general, there weren't huge gaps between those two. There were gaps in terms of the type of employment that they were engaged in. So, and not surprisingly, more casual work, more temporary work, compared to more permanent work that they had in Syria. And this is consistent across all three countries. So we also asked them about their employment experiences and their perceptions of employment. And I will just point out a few things here. In both Lebanon and Jordan, our survey respondents reported that the vast majority of them reported being concerned about getting into trouble with the government if they were caught working. And it's interesting because this is in contrast to Turkey, where less than half, maybe about 40% of them said they were afraid of getting in trouble with the government if they were caught working. So there's much more enforcement of this issue here than there is in Turkey, or at least much more fear of it being enforced here and in Jordan compared to Turkey. The other thing I will say is the last three comments, the last 3 points, which is that Syrians expressed inability to pay for a work permit, not being able to find an employer to sponsor a work permit, but they said that employers were willing to hire them. So they felt that employers were willing to hire them, but not sponsor them, and they certainly couldn't afford the work permit themselves. We asked them a series of questions about things like discrimination, respect in the workplace, asked them about other sort of features of their work environment. Interestingly and encouragingly, our respondents reported that they did not feel like they were discriminated against by employers or their fellow employees, despite perceptions of that. They also felt that they were respected, that they reported being respected. I think this is an interesting thing to kind of think about and to use potentially as leverage, that even though there is a public perception of that, maybe at an individual level, relationships are good, at least among our survey respondents. There were concerns about harassment in the workplace, and this was a question that was asked of everyone, whether there were concerns about Syrian women being harassed in the workplace. It was fairly high here in Lebanon compared to Jordan and Turkey. And then as well as lack of reliable transportation for Syrian women to the workplace. About 60% reported being afraid of physical harm in the workplace, and I think this is a reflection of the type of work that they were engaged in. So not necessarily physical harm from other people, but the type of work that they were engaged in may be dangerous, especially given the high percentage of them working in the construction sector. Okay, so one of the issues we were interested in is whether there was a geographic mismatch. So are refugees located in areas where there aren't as many economic opportunities, and would they be willing to move to an area where there are employment opportunities? We asked this across all 3 countries. It's particularly the case in Turkey, because many of them are either concentrated in the south, at the border, or in Istanbul, and won't go anywhere else where there is more of an industrial base for them to work in. In Lebanon, maybe this is not as much of a concern, but it was still a question we wanted to ask to compare across all 3 countries. And what we find is that about 1/3 or so of our survey respondents, with the exception of Beirut, were willing to go move to a place where they would find employment. If employment opportunities were available, they would be willing to move, about 1/3 of them. Okay, so I know I went very fast through the household survey. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to focus now on the demand side, which is the perspective of firms, to sort of get an understanding of what their standpoint is with respect to hiring Syrians. Virtually all the firms in our sample had Syrian employees, higher in some areas compared to others. In the Baqa, it's quite high, more than 40%. Basically, this is the percentage of Syrians the average percentage of Syrians as part of the employees in the company. So
that's one thing that was unique to Lebanon, that every firm in the sample had, some Syrians working for them. It was much lower in Jordan and Turkey, less than 50% of the firms.
And I think this is also a reflection of sort of the history of Syrians working in the Lebanese labor market. Consistent with low education level, many of them are working in unskilled jobs. So they're not working in high skilled, they're working in unskilled jobs. Except that they are they're not as in unskilled position as much as the migrant workers. So the migrant workers are the most who are in unskilled jobs, followed by the Syrian refugees and then local Lebanese. We asked firms about the advantages of hiring Syrian refugees and the disadvantages of hiring Syrian refugees. The advantages of hiring Syrian refugees from the perspective of firms is that they're willing to perform tasks that I think from their perspective, Lebanese are not willing to perform. They work longer hours, they work for lower wages, so these are things that employers felt were advantages to hiring Syrian refugees. As far as disadvantages were concerned, the lack of a residency or work permit, so the lack of clarity about the legal status was a disadvantage of hiring refugees. And anecdotally, we heard this because, in the sense that if you don't have a residency permit as a Syrian refugee and you're trying to get to work and you're concerned about a checkpoint, for example, where they will check your residency permit, you might decide not to go to work that day. And so there's this issue of not reliability with them because of their legal status. We also asked firms about what policies could be put in place to increase employment of all people, so not just Syrian refugees, but across the board. And they basically focused on things that will reduce the cost to employers. So lower taxes, benefit subsidies, reducing bureaucracy. Those are, and in fact, a large share of manufacturing firms, especially in the food and beverage industry, anticipated increases in employment. So over the next 12 months, but they were focused on trying to reduce the cost of operating, which would increase the chance that they would hire people. As far as what policies would increase the hiring of Syrian refugees, again, back to this issue of legal status, clarifying their legal status, allowing to, making it very clear what their legal status is, and ensuring that they would have the ability to go to work without being concerned about it. Okay, so in summary, for Lebanon, essentially the theme that kept coming up was this issue of the residency permit, the legal status. That is the main concern from both the refugee and the employer perspective. I'm not going to go into much detail here because I think we sort of get the picture of the issue of their skill level and education status. I think one thing that is sort of interesting is this issue of perception and reality, and I know that we are aware of the efforts that IFI has done to try to address this issue, putting the facts out there to change public perception about and Dr. Nasser alluded to this in the beginning about the narrative. And then I think it's also important to recognize that the economic situation across all three countries is at issue here. So the lack of opportunities has a lot to do with the economic situation as well. Okay, so I am briefly going to go through our comparison across three countries, our synthesis across three countries, and then I'll hand it over back to Krishna to continue it. So one of the things I mentioned was that we asked across all our surveys, we asked about the obstacles to employment. And you can see that it's actually quite interesting because it's fairly consistent across all three countries. Some things were more important in some countries versus others. For example, language was a big issue in Turkey. So this is, again, from the perspective of the refugees. Inability to speak Turkish was a barrier, a perceived barrier to finding employment. In Lebanon, Again, the economic situation, lack of availability of jobs, difficulty to get the work permit, and difficulty to get a residency permit were among the top 3 issues that they mentioned. There was this perception, at least except for Turkey, well, actually, across all 3 countries, a low percentage of refugees reported that there were organizations willing to support them finding work. So, there may be more of a focus on humanitarian assistance, less the perception is there aren't organizations to help them with livelihood, with finding opportunities to work. So that was something that was consistently reported across all 3 countries. About a third, about 30% of refugees here reported getting any assistance for livelihood. Again, I mentioned this before that refugees in, at least our survey respondents in Lebanon reported being more, and in Jordan, reported being more concerned about the government catching them working, about feeling like they could go to the government to get support, compared to, say, Turkey, where it was, they felt that they were less likely to get in trouble, could go to the authorities if they were having a problem. About close to 60% of refugees in our survey reported being concerned about losing assistance if they did work. And then finally, we asked them about the training that they received. Interestingly, about half of them reported that they could get the training that they needed, but a relatively lower percentage said that they were actually getting training. So about a third of them said that they were getting training. And I think this is interesting because we hear that there are lots of vocational technical trainings available across all 3 countries to refugees so that they can be prepared for work. But the numbers, at least in our survey, seem much lower than that. So only about a third of them are reporting that they're actually getting any training.
Thank you, Louay. And hi to Lillian, who's from Ipsos. You missed our slide when I was saying how much we bugged you with our questionnaire changes and constantly, but the data you collected was very helpful. Thank you. So just to wrap this up, one of the things that all these 3 countries faced was the countries were anyway slowing down, and the problem was exacerbated by the arrival of the refugees. But these economies were in trouble to begin with. And Dr. Nasser kept telling us repeatedly that one of the things you need to emphasize is the need for structural reforms in the economy. It's not just the refugees, but the overall economy has been hurting. So when we asked people, Louay already presented for Lebanon what was needed. In general, people wanted certain policies to help the economies grow. And going back to this perception versus reality, one striking disconnect in all 3 countries was this popular perception that refugees are taking away our jobs and are hurting the economy, versus companies wanting to hire them and actually thinking that these people add value, fill gaps in the labor market, and actually contribute to the economy. So in other words, 30% of the food and beverages firm and 20% of manufacturing firms, 25% of hotels and restaurants in Lebanon all felt that they will be hiring in the near future, and almost all of them said, as long as you can get the legal issues sorted out, we'd be willing to hire Syrian refugees. That's the key thing that they wanted clarified. So, Louay presented this for Lebanon, but the point was similar across Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, in that people, firms like the ease of doing business, ease of starting business, that's what they care about: lower taxes and lower bureaucratic headaches. As far as increasing Syrian employment, we saw that in Lebanon, the key thing is legal issues. That was also the case in Jordan. People wanted work permits to be, easier to get. In the case of Turkey, one difference that keeps coming up is the language, right? Like at least in Jordan and Lebanon, they can get by in Arabic, whereas in Turkey, they needed to be trained in language. And in general, the firms in Turkey were a bit more pessimistic. If you ask them, what can we do to help the Syrians? Oh, we can do nothing. On the other hand, they employed quite a few Syrians, so there was a disconnect between what they said and what they actually did. Social cohesion, Louay mentioned this for Lebanon, but in general, despite the tensions we saw in the focus groups and so on, and this is a point that was made by Mr. Ziad in the Ministry of Displaced Persons as well, which is that there's not been wholesale riots and so on that have erupted, and in general you find that most of our survey respondents across the country say that they've not been regularly discriminated against, and most of them feel like the co-workers are treating them with respect. One interesting thing we found across the countries was that women were more willing to work. So if you look at the percentage of Syrian women willing to work, it ranged between 25% in Turkey to 54% in Jordan, with Lebanon in between, which is much higher than the percentage of Syrian women who wanted to work while they were in Syria. So there was people felt a need that they had to work in order to supplement income. There was also greater willingness to work. They said it had become socially more acceptable, both by men and women, for women to work. But as Louay pointed out, higher rates of women are not able to find work. There was a worry about harassment and harm in the workplace. It was a little bit more pronounced in Lebanon than in the other two countries, as well as the need for reliable and safe transportation was more acutely felt in Lebanon. So in general, despite rising tensions, our overall study finds that there are opportunities, there are gaps in the economy that the Syrians can fill and add value. And likewise, as I mentioned, employers are willing to hire them, especially if the overall business climate for them is improved and the regulations are made clearer. Repeatedly, what we heard, and this is sort of like a news to the international community, this was most strongly expressed in Lebanon, but in other countries as well, is that these countries have already been extremely hospitable to refugees, and they're providing a public good for the world, and in return, they were hoping that the donor community and other countries invested more in these countries. So the last couple of slides, just to give you a flavor of the kind of recommendations we made. I don't expect you to read this in great detail, but it shows you, the level of detail we went into to provide recommendations. In addition to the recommendation, we went into the rationale, implementation considerations, pointing out various agencies that, say, donor countries or multilaterals could work with in order to implement the policy, our subjective assessment of whether this is a high, low, or medium priority, costs and risks of implementation. Again, it is our subjective assessment based on our stakeholder interviews and so on. And a lot of times the cost or risk of implementation are political. The actual cost of implementing something might not be high, but the political cost might be high. And then finally, who are these recommendations suitable for, individual donor countries? Because as I mentioned, our study was funded by the generosity of the Qatar Fund for Development, which is always looking to implement programs. So they have this program called Quest for Syrian refugees. They've already implemented in the area of health and education, and now they're going to get into economic empowerment. So they wanted a sense of direction on what programs they should concentrate on, as well as for multilateral agencies and the government. So broadly, across all three countries, recommendations are not surprising, but it's worth still reiterating some of these. Relax the sectors and the geography in which Syrian refugees can work. There is supply and demand, but there also needs to be a matching of jobs. In many of these regions, the matching was not very efficient. Even though there might be job openings and people are available to fill them, and especially in the informal sector, people are not getting together. As Louay mentioned, it was really word of mouth is how people found jobs, and that is not the most efficient way of matching them. And the vocational training, people wanted it to be market-driven. There's a lot of vocational education that's not always coordinated and always, market-driven. So, in particular, in Lebanon, when you think about matching of employers and employees, again, it's easy to say that we need more vocational training, but we were able to identify even like some of the key areas in which training is needed, such as mechanical and technical skills, security, construction, English, cooking, working in restaurants. These were all some of the areas in which people needed training. I already mentioned making it easier for people to move around. There was also an overwhelming call for relaxing the sectors in which Syrians can work beyond, construction and agriculture and environment or cleaning, as it is called. We talked a little bit about this. Many people, in our focus groups felt, oh, the Syrians get assistance, and then on top of that, they work for lower wages. Together, they're making more than we are doing. And a few other people said donor fatigue is already set in for assistance. But there is a very complicated trade-off between providing assistance for the most needy versus, creating the appropriate incentives for people to work, and the effect all this has on the resentment that the local population feels. That's one area where I think, we just scratched the surface and more work can be done. We talked about, the need for investment, especially in Lebanon. There was constantly a worry about whether this money will get dispersed efficiently, effectively, whether the procurement will be open and transparent. So we felt that many government agencies could use some capacity building on, issuing procurement and dispersing, investment money. And then finally, we already talked about assessing the gap between reality and perception. So the kind of work that Issam, Faris, and others do to get absolute facts outside is important, because otherwise people get this misguided perception of what is actually happening versus what is the reality on the ground. Thank you. That was pretty fast. We went through a lot of information, but hopefully it gave you a flavor, and we want to use the remaining half an hour or so on discussions if there is.
This is a friendly audience here. So you should do this in a more hostile audience. You'd expect then some fireworks. Yeah. But still, I think there are some. I would expect some, valid questions to be raised, and we'll give the floor for our colleagues to answer any questions. But in the meantime, I think there's an issue that's always been, we're challenging our thinking around whether Syrian refugees would substitute, if there's substitution, or as a matter of fact, if there is no substitution, there could be taking jobs that potentially new entrants to the workforce might not be able to get, particularly on the lower segments of the least paid or the less paid jobs. And so that's maybe your expertise as economists can enlighten us on this. But meantime, let's have some questions maybe from the table, from around. Please do. Please.
Yeah. No, this is a great point. I mean, most of the firms we talked to felt that the Syrian refugees were taking jobs that no one else wanted to do. And every time we got into the data here, I could not help draw a comparison with the state I live in, which is the state of California in the US, where there are lots of undocumented migrants from, particularly from Latin America. And there's the same disconnect where people think that they're taking jobs away, whereas, especially farmers and so on, feeling that these people, fill a much needed gap in the labor market. But it's, that's a valid question to think of. And moreover, in the context of Lebanon and Jordan, the margin of adjustment seems to not be local workers as much as other migrant workers from Egypt and, in the case of Jordan, from Bangladesh and other places. Yeah.
Okay. Please.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm Armenak from International Crisis Group, working on a similar topic. I have two questions, if I may. The first is about the same issue that Nasser raised. Obviously, there are gaps in the Lebanese economy. There's no proper market research, as far as I know. And I agree with you that Syrians can feel the gap. But don't you think there are too many Syrians? So there's surplus. So if we say, let's say, 500,000 Syrians are needed for the Lebanese economy, what do we do with the rest, with 1 million? For instance, agriculture that you mentioned, through my interviews, I've never heard a Lebanese complaining that the Syrians are working in agriculture. But you have so many other sectors where they are, in fact, competing with the Lebanese. And the second one is, you mentioned to open the sectors legally for the Syrians to legally work in many other sectors. And I've heard this recommendation from many people. But let's say you were a senior Lebanese official who had, with some magic, the power to do that. Like, would you open all sectors for Syrians to work? Thanks.
Thank you. They're great questions. We met many of your colleagues in the Doha Forum, so I'm happy to have somebody from. Sorry? I missed it. Okay, to ask this question. So first of all, as far as too many Syrians, many of the Syrians do want to go back, and I saw, this brochure in your publications as well, when the situation becomes relevant. So a lot of what we, like the training and so on, we recommend, and the experience again here will be helpful when they go back to Syria for reconstruction, right? So I think, probably the one useful lesson I learned in graduate school in economics is that socioeconomics is not a zero-sum game. Almost always we think of things as a fixed pie and, we get some, somebody else gets some. But I think, socioeconomics is, sort of a positive-sum game. So when we talked to Veritech, who, Tom kindly, introduced us to, they were saying, for example, restaurants, cooking business, being able to cook in large kitchens and supply lunch and food to, employees in Lebanon. The Syrians would like to do that. There is not enough of a supply of those services here. So if we think creatively and imaginatively, the economy can grow. So we don't have to think of this as a zero-sum game. Having said that, I am completely aware as an economist that the first order response when you increase the supply of workers, the wages will drop, especially at the lowest level where there is a lot of competition. But I'm trying to counter that with more of an expansion of the pie point of view. And as far as opening the sectors, this is one sector, like cooking, restaurant, business, is particularly where people felt that the Syrians would have a comparative advantage. But Louay, do you?
Yeah, I was just to kind of follow up on that. I mean, I think the creating demand, providing opportunities for them to provide services that aren't currently being provided is one way of addressing this issue. I mean, again, keeping in mind that we are talking about a lot of people that's, completely understand this position. I think the other thing is to think about it also, and I know there are challenges to this that are difficult to control. And then I think, Dr. Nasser, you've raised this before as well, but leveraging the number, leveraging the proportion to say, look, Lebanon is providing a public good, the international community, the major powers owe Lebanon a great deal of debt for providing this public good, providing this service, and should be investing in the country. I think, we can all agree that there is a tremendous need in infrastructure investment, in renovating hospitals and renovating schools and renovating transportation networks. And one can only imagine that doing that will create opportunities for both Lebanese and for Syrians in terms of work. Again, I know the obstacles are large. The governance issue is an issue that many of these major powers discuss a lot, but it is something that it's a powerful argument once you can address the governance issue.
And in fact, the creation of such infrastructure will ease the strain on the services that the sheer number of refugees are putting. That's another thing as well.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks. I mean, just picking up on that theme, for me, I agree with what you're saying. As an economist, it's not a zero-sum game and these kind of messages, but the reality is it's far more nuanced than that. And I think particularly your recommendations, I would revisit them. I think, for example, short-term training and vocational courses, we know it's oversupplied at the moment. I mean, okay, I'm sure maybe in your sample there's a lot of people saying they're not being trained, but when you look at the numbers just from the LCRP, 2017, 35,000, this year we're getting on towards 20,000, we need to put more money into the demand side. And your data actually reinforces that. It says there's not enough jobs. So to me, that should be one of your recommendations. And that, I really think that should be there. Sorry. The work permits and the restrictions, I mean, and the residency, look at the residency data. It was 27% Syrians had residency back in 2017, and just now the data is almost exactly the same. I mean, it's clearly a political issue. Mm-hmm. And, I'm not sure it really helps putting it as a recommendation. Everyone's aware of that. Yeah. We can sit here, like-minded people. Mm-hmm. So what? Mm-hmm. It does need to be addressed. I agree with you. You need to get the facts out there, but we need more than that. So I think, like that, it's not helpful. You need to think more. We need to think more. What can we be doing about this issue? So I think that you've got to have more substance there if you're going to make a recommendation like that. And finally, I come back. You're presenting data from firms who, of course, there is, okay, it's the California example, but it's a lot worse. There's not only do you have Syrians, you have imported labor on, all the domestic help from Ethiopia. Every guy who packs your bag in spinnies is from Bangladesh. I don't think there's a country in the world with a bigger glut of cheaper labor. Now, clearly, there are very powerful people benefiting and engaged in that. And it's easy politically to sort of throw it back and say, oh, well, the Syrians will take all our jobs kind of argument. But, we have to be, it's a political discussion. It's very much a political issue. And your recommendations must be really, I would say, as internationals, as foreigners, geared towards the international players. I mean, there's a lot, the Lebanese government could do a lot differently, but sorry, that's for Lebanese, and they're doing it to address their government and make those points. But as an international working here, we can definitely put more pressure on the countries that are not really allowing any refugees to come to them.
Right.
And that should be our role. And you should address that here.
Okay.
Like demand side. The EU thing for Jordan has been a complete failure, basically.
Yes.
Now, the EU are brilliant at stopping people importing into going into their markets because, you've got the wrong chemical or you used the wrong substance or something. And Lebanon is a consumption economy. I'm not an economist, but that's what I heard. There's only so much can go round.
Yeah.
We need to create more short-term jobs for poor people, whether they be Lebanese or Syrians.
Right.
Just set the daily wage or the whatever wage they get paid low and think about how we do that. And we all know that, but we really struggle with how to do it. And here, I worry about your recommendations. I don't think they're going to facilitate that happening. And as international organizations, playing the international role. One thing's a discussion with the government. That needs to happen. There needs to be more pressure on the Lebanese government. And people like Issam Fares are doing the best they can. There needs to be, that's a very sensitive issue. And I would argue that's where the Lebanese need to come in, maybe with a bit of push from the international community. But where we can do more is with our own Western governments. And you must highlight demand.
Yeah. Absolutely. So thanks, Tom. I mean, there was a lot there. I need to unpack several issues. So no, that was great. This is great. See, so it was not as friendly a crowd as you thought. It would be. No, but I take the spirit of the comments. I really appreciate them. So the first thing is that what you're seeing in the research brief is just the highlights of 4 or 5 bullets. So what I was trying to say is that if you look at our actual report, there are like 20 pages of really detailed, recommendations and so on. And, when you take, like, for example, vocational education, we absolutely, note everywhere that there is a glut of this, kind of training, which is like everybody presents in an uncoordinated way, a lot of training, and they've not been, really effective, because they're not market-driven, which is why when we recommend, and that's exactly why I read out those very specific fields in which you need training, is that you need very specific market-driven, and in fact, like if you read our report, we say that, like chambers of commerce need to be working with the training people so that the training is market-driven and the job matching and the placement can happen. And as far as demand, absolutely. I mean, in fact, that's where a lot of our, recommendations on ease of doing business and improving, entrepreneurship, allowing Syrians themselves to become entrepreneurs are focused on. So clearly, completely agree with you that more needs to be done on demand. And I would argue that, half or more of our recommendations are really based on demand. In fact, except for that vocational training thing, which is market-driven, nearly most of our recommendations, whether it's improving government capacity for procurement and investment, all these are job creation, the ones that Louay mentioned for Lebanese and the Syrians. So completely agree with you. I'm just clarifying that much of what you're saying is in the report, in the more detailed tables and so on. As far as the residency and other issues go, and this is a point that one of our reviewers made as well, yes, not all our recommendations are new. I would say about maybe half or more of them are new based on, our study. Half of them are kind of a rehash of existing, recommendations. But the fact is that, they are not done and somebody else needs to repeatedly point this out, and hopefully there's a critical mass of, what shall I say, appeal to policymakers that some of these can be done. And we also completely agree that much of this is a political issue, but it doesn't mean that we should not be highlighting them for the case of the policymakers. And then you talked about, international players. Again, completely agree. You mentioned how Jordan Compact is not working. In fact, one of our recommendations for Jordan is that, let's get this to work. Here are the problems. The rules of origin are, really not that, relaxed. They're still restrictive. In the case of, Lebanon, for investment, as you mentioned, Louay, as well, that people think that we are providing a public good here. In turn, we need investment. In fact, all of these, again, come back to demand creation. So your points are very well taken. I don't quarrel with the points per se, but I just want to point out that many of these things we do delve into in our detailed recommendations and so on. Louay, do you want to add something? And I'm sure.
I mean, I
Nasser
just
would.
basically reiterate Krishna's comments. I mean, I agree, and I think we had talked about this before, and I remember you very clearly telling us back in January that there is all these vocational training programs that are made available. People take them because maybe it's a way to get a meal, it's a way to spend the time, it's a way to get a stipend, and but all this money is being wasted where it could be invested in other pursuits. Completely agree. I mean, I think that this is an issue, this is a concern. I mean, this is where, if you were to take the example of infrastructure investment and creation of jobs, then you can think much more clearly about, okay, there is going to be a need for, if you were to address all the other issues, there's going to be a need here for workers with specialized types of skills, and that's what the vocational training should be targeting. It should be targeting where there is a need and there is a demand, and not something that's just provided so that people can, attend and get a free meal. So, I mean, there's no question about that, and I think we, as Krishna mentioned, we try to address this. And I think what's also coming out in your voice, and we appreciate, and I think we certainly got this in our various trips to Lebanon and in looking at the data as well, that there's a tremendous amount of frustration. There's a tremendous amount of frustration at the among the Lebanese public, among stakeholders involved in working with refugees, that things are calcified in some sense. There isn't movement on various issues. And I mean, I think what we're hoping to do is to provide an added voice, an added perspective on this. But I agree. I mean, this is not something that can just be addressed with a list of recommendations. I mean, you have to take those and try to figure out how they can be implemented in concert with everybody, all the other players in this arena.
I would also say that the very fact that we did firm surveys as opposed to many other previous studies, and we did all these in-depth interviews of firms, goes back to what you were saying, Tom, that demand should be at the forefront. It's not just more and more supply, because as you say, there's a glut of people, and it's not clear whether the glut of people who are trained make things any better. If anything, they might be even more frustrated that we get trained and we don't get any other jobs.
And I would just add, I know we're going to move to a question, but just a quick comment. I mean, this issue of demand is not just specific to Syrian refugees. It is a frustration that is regional for young people. Why is unemployment so high among young people? And there's this argument about, is it a supply issue? Is it a demand issue? I mean, there's no question that I think this issue of demand, this issue of barriers to creating jobs and declining, contracting economies is something that is affecting the entire region.
We'll take two more questions, unless there's a third, but we'll take two because I'm also conscious about your flight. So
okay.
Please, and then, okay.
Thank you. Ilina Slavova from International Alert. I have two quick questions. One is about Jordan. We know that the government of Jordan handled work permits differently than the Lebanese government. Are there any lessons from there that anything appear to be working better than it does here? My second question is about the role of employers. There are two findings that I found very interesting in a positive way. One, that there is not too much exploitation reported in the survey, and the other one is that employers actually recognize the need for easing the regulations for Syrian employees. Is there willingness, is there any appetite among employers to make these points and engage in advocacy in any way? Thank you.
Excellent questions. Very quickly on Jordan work permit, one of the most fascinating meetings that Louay and I had was with the Jordanian General Federation of Trade Unions, and we thought they will be extremely protective of Jordanian workers, but they said workers are workers, we want to protect everybody's rights, and they have an agreement with Jordan to actually help the refugees get permits, because, just the bureaucracy, the having to deal with such complicated regulations is very difficult. So definitely having an advocate for them like the GFJTU would be very helpful. And the recommendation we make there is that I think they have an agreement until the end of the year with the government. And if you go through the GFJTU for your work permit, your fees are waived. So we suggest that it be continued, and that they can also play a role in the education of the rules and regulation to Syrians. Just being able to educate them, saying that this is what is available, this is what you need to do, will be helpful. So clearly here, having a counterpart like that, an advocate like that, would be helpful. I know many of the UN organizations and ILO and so on do that as well. As far as exploitation, that's a great point. I mean, if I understand your question right, if the employers say that the regulations need to become, more harmonized, easier, and streamlined, why don't they lobby the government for it? Is another way of asking a question, right? I don't know whether we saw an appetite, for that. I mean, people tend to complain more than group together and set things right. Did you recall?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't specifically explore this issue of lobbying the government. I mean, I think they're expecting the guidance to come from above, from the government. And I mean, in some ways, although they mentioned that this issue of the work permit and the residency permit, they would like it addressed, the regulatory aspect of it. In some ways, they are benefiting from the situation because they can hire them at very low wages, and this is certainly the case with the other two countries. They can hire them at really low wages. They can keep them for very long hours. With a work permit, they're much more likely now to have to report these things, and they're subject to regulations as well. So it's a double, it's a double-edged sword in some way. I mean, in some ways they want things clarified, but in the other way they are benefiting from the lack of regulations as well.
It goes back to what Tom was saying, that somebody is benefiting in an exploitative way, and yeah.
Yeah, I have a question concerning Syrian refugees in Jordan, specifically since we talked about the EU Jordan Compact. And my question here is whether you were able to include in your sample Syrian refugees who were introduced to employment opportunities in the market, for example, in the special development zones under the EU Jordan Compact, since here the perspectives might be really different, whether from the firms or from refugees themselves. And my other question is, you mentioned that the recommendation regarding this compact is for them to be less restrictive, and I'm wondering whether you had more observations or you were able to include other recommendations in your report regarding that.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, the Jordan Compact, again, as Tom mentioned, has been a big disappointment in the case of Jordan. To be very honest, most employers have not heard of the various concessions under this. So finding employees who know this, at least in our surveys, was extremely difficult. I mean, in our focus groups and so on, there was not any enhanced knowledge of being able to benefit from this compact. Clearly it was not there. We talked extensively to the program management unit in MOPIC, the ministry that is responsible for the refugee coordination, and they are trying to come up with, I think one of their programs called Easy Wins, trying to find those firms that can actually benefit from this and provide technical assistance to them so that they can hire, but it's been extremely difficult to find the qualified refugees. As you might imagine, if you're more of an export-oriented firm, you're requesting, higher human capital, refugees who are hard to come by. The one good news is that, it was supposed to go from 15% to 25%, the threshold level of Syrians you need to employ before you can qualify for this. And luckily, from what I hear in the last few weeks, they have decided they're not going to increase it to 25%. So the threshold remains 15%, which is some kind of a good news, but I really think that that is scratching at the surface. So to make it less restrictive, I think it needs to be available to more industries, but also, geographically, having these development zones and expecting Syrians to move there, especially when Louay presented the fact that more than half really do not want to move, and in the case of women, lack transportation, safety, and so on, is a little bit too much. So I think the relaxation needs to come from the sectors and the geography side. I don't know, do you want to?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think, as Krishna mentioned, the number of firms that actually qualify under the current regulations is really small. So unlikely that much of our sample actually would have captured people who are taking advantage of these opportunities. I mean, there's also this issue of how do they get to the zones? Because even though they're located not far from where refugees are, there's still a transportation issue for them to get to those zones. The issue of sort of less restrictive, I mean, I think, most of the people that we had talked to, most of the stakeholders kind of agree that the compact needs to be renegotiated in some way, that it's just not in its current framework going to be, it's not doing its job. It's not going to be helpful. It needs to be renegotiated. But I think coupled with that, and as Krishna mentioned, I mean, there are efforts to provide technical support and technical assistance to companies to be able to meet whatever requirements end up being renegotiated, because that's going to be an important facet of it. But at a fundamental level, it needs to be completely restructured.
By the way, all the large firms in our Turkey and Jordan sample, we intentionally had them come from the special industrialized zones. We have a little bit more on the report on exports and so on.
Very good. Thank you so much, Krishna. Thank you so much, Louay. I think this is very interesting. I know this is not a topic that we all agree on how to, get into the policy circles or the recommendations. But we all agree that the key here is expanding the economy and preventing it from shrinking further, and hopefully with some regulatory aspects, some relaxing certain regulations, it might bring opportunities for all. But of course, I think the main issue here is there are increasingly more hostilities within the policy-making spaces against even discussing this subject. And of course, among the communities. I just tweeted and you get a reaction. Do you think the Lebanese economy can afford $350,000? So it's straight away. In seconds, you get the same position, same narrative that has been happening for many years now. But anyway, we'll continue to tackle this subject. In 6 months' time, we'll have 6 case studies on how refugee communities are adapting informally to displacement, how they can actually have more agency to create more livelihood opportunities for themselves and their host communities. So hopefully 6 case studies will be presented next May, June, or depending if Mesa agrees on that. We also have a working paper just published on jobs make the difference, and this kind of simulation around, yes, exactly, by a colleague from Oxford. It's a working paper on simulating different ways of investing in the economy and the number of jobs expected to be created in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And there are other, projects in the pipeline, talking to or discussing with trade unions, with syndicates, and so on. So that was great. Thank you so much for the presentation and the lively discussion, and we shall continue. Thank you.
Thank you.